17-year-old Ethan Walker entered the Franklin County courtroom with a chilling display of arrogance, brazenly laughing at the family of the man he had brutally murdered, David Campbell. Believing his youth would offer him immunity, he treated the legal proceedings as a mere charade, utterly oblivious that the justice system was closing in around him. Yet, the most damning testimony would not emerge from a seasoned expert or a law enforcement officer, but from the one individual who truly understood the monstrous facade he presented. His own mother. The evening of October 12th settled upon the tranquil suburban streets of Westerville, Ohio, bringing with it a familiar autumn chill. Leaves skittered across perfectly manicured lawns under the sterile glow of streetlights, each home a small sanctuary of warmth and routine against the encroaching darkness. Inside his modest two-story house on Maple Creek Lane, 52-year-old David Campbell was preparing for the night, the aroma of a late dinner still perfuming the air. A man of quiet habits and simple pleasures, this high school history teacher had dedicated 3 decades to shaping young minds with tales of the past, entirely unaware that his own narrative was about to reach a brutal and senseless conclusion. The neighborhood's tranquility, however, was merely an illusion, a fragile veneer stretched over a darkness poised to shatter the community's sense of security. David Campbell had lived in this house for nearly 2 decades, his life a testament to stability and kindness. He was known for his meticulously kept garden and his readiness to assist any neighbor in need. That night, the only sounds were the distant hum of traffic and the rustle of the wind, a peaceful symphony that offered no warning of the impending violence. The attack was not a robbery gone awry or an act of passionate rage. It was an intrusion of pure, unmotivated malice, an event so savage that it would leave investigators searching for a motive that simply did not exist. The first official record of the tragedy arrived at 10:47 p.m., logged as a terse, anonymous 911 call reporting screams from the Campbell residence. The dispatcher heard only a few panicked words before the line went dead, a chilling silence that prompted the immediate dispatch of 2 patrol cars. Officers arrived within minutes to a scene of unsettling normality. The porch light was on, a newspaper lay on the welcome mat, and there were no visible signs of forced entry. It was only when they peered through a side window into the living room that the illusion shattered, revealing a scene of such profound violence that it would be seared into their memories for the remainder of their careers. Inside, David Campbell lay on the floor, his life extinguished in a brutal, chaotic struggle that had overturned furniture and left crimson stains upon the pale beige carpet. The sheer barbarity of the attack was immediately apparent, far exceeding what was necessary to subdue a single man, suggesting a rage that was both deeply personal and pathological. The initial search of the home yielded no immediate motive. Campbell's wallet rested on the kitchen counter with cash still inside, and valuable electronics remained untouched, systematically dismantling the theory of a simple burglary. The only thing taken from the house was a life, leaving behind a vacuum of grief and 1,000 unanswered questions that would soon fall to the Westerville Police Department to resolve. The crime scene stood as a testament to nihilism, a violent statement devoid of clear purpose, and detectives understood that their investigation would not be about tracking money, but about pursuing the monster responsible for such a pointless act of destruction. The notification to the family was a task dreaded by every law enforcement officer, a delicate and terrible surgery on the soul of a family. David's sister, Amelia Sanchez, received the call just after midnight, the clinical voice of the detective on the other end of the line, cleaving her world in two. Disbelief was the initial wave of defense, a desperate hope that this was some horrific mistake, a confusion of names or addresses that would soon be corrected. But as the detective gently yet firmly insisted on the facts, her denial crumbled, replaced by a wave of grief so immense it felt like a physical drowning, pulling her under into a cold, dark reality from which there would be no escape. She and her husband drove to the police station in a state of shock, the familiar streets of their city now alien and hostile territory. At the station, the grim reality of the situation was laid bare in the sterile, fluorescent-lit confines of a small interview room. Detectives offered their condolences, their words professional, yet imbued with a shared human sorrow. But the details they provided only deepened the horror. They spoke of a home invasion, of extreme violence, but could offer no explanation, no context for the madness that had stolen her brother from the world. Amelia's mind reeled, attempting to reconcile the image of her gentle, scholarly brother with the brutal scene the officers described, but the two realities could not coexist. The man they were discussing, the victim of a savage attack, was not the David she knew, the uncle who brought her kids silly gifts and spent hours debating historical events with a twinkle in his eye. The initial stages of the investigation were a blur of procedural necessities and raw emotion for the Campbell family. They were asked for names of potential enemies, for details of David's routines, for any shred of information that might illuminate the darkness that had consumed him. But David had no enemies. He was a universally liked man, a fixture in his community whose only conflicts were gentle disagreements over historical interpretations with his students. The family's search for answers became a desperate circular exercise in futility, their grief compounded by the utter senselessness of the crime. The absence of a motive was a particular kind of torture, as it denied them the small comfort of understanding, leaving them to grapple with the terrifying knowledge that such profound evil could exist without reason or warning. The community of Westerville reeled from the news, which spread like a poison through the town's bloodstream. A murder in their quiet suburb was rare enough, but the brutal, inexplicable nature of David Campbell's death sent a shockwave of fear and disbelief through the populace. He was not just a name in a news report. He was Mr. Campbell, the teacher who made history come alive, the neighbor who always waved, the familiar face at the local grocery store. His death was a personal violation to the thousands of lives he had touched, a stark reminder that the carefully constructed walls of suburban safety were fragile and easily breached. Vigils were held, and makeshift memorials of flowers and candles grew on his lawn, small gestures of collective grief against an overwhelming tide of sorrow and confusion, as an entire town awaited the answer to a single, terrifying question. Who could have done this? The investigation did not languish in uncertainty for long. In a world of digital footprints and constant surveillance, hiding from a crime of this magnitude had become an almost impossible task. The breakthrough in the case came not from a mysterious informant or a complex forensic puzzle, but from the mundane, ubiquitous technology of a neighbor's doorbell camera. The device, positioned across the street from David Campbell's home, had captured a grainy but clear image of a lone figure walking away from the house at approximately 10:35 p.m. At just minutes before the 911 call was made, the individual was young, dressed in dark clothing, and moved with a casual, unhurried gait that was chillingly at odds with the horror that had just unfolded inside. Detectives spent the next 48 hours canvassing the neighborhood, cross-referencing the image with local school yearbooks and social media, a painstaking process of digital forensics that soon yielded a name: Ethan Walker. He was a 17-year-old high school senior who resided just a few blocks away, a teenager known for petty delinquency and a simmering, defiant arrogance, but nothing that would have suggested a capacity for such extreme violence. He had been a student in David Campbell's history class 2 years prior, a fact that added a disturbing layer of familiarity to the crime. With a positive identification from multiple sources, the Westerville police obtained a search warrant for the Walker residence and an arrest warrant for Ethan, preparing to confront the young man whose image was now the focal point of their homicide investigation. The arrest was executed on a crisp Thursday morning, the tactical team descending on the Walkers' modest suburban home with quiet, practiced efficiency. There was no dramatic standoff, no chase. Ethan's father answered the door, his face a mask of confusion that quickly morphed into dawning horror as he read the warrant. Ethan was discovered in his bedroom playing a video game, the sounds of simulated gunfire filling the small space. He looked up at the officers who flooded his room with a gaze not of fear or surprise, but of bored annoyance, as if their intrusion was merely an inconvenient interruption. The armor of his adolescent detachment was impenetrable, and he offered no resistance as he was handcuffed, his eyes empty of any discernible emotion. During the search of his room, detectives found the evidence that would forge an unbreakable link between Ethan Walker and the murder of David Campbell. Tucked away in a laundry hamper were a pair of sneakers, their soles stained with a faint reddish brown that lab technicians would later confirm was a perfect match for the victim's blood type. A black hoodie matching the one seen in the doorbell camera footage was found stuffed under his mattress. However, the most damning revelation was the absence of a decorative knife from his dresser collection, a fantasy-style blade whose distinctive serrated edge precisely matched several wounds on the victim's body. The physical evidence coalesced into an overwhelming, silent, yet irrefutable chorus of accusations against the stoic teenager now sitting in the police cruiser's back seat, watching his life recede in the rearview mirror. Later that morning, the interrogation commenced in an austere, windowless room at police headquarters, an environment meticulously designed to amplify psychological pressure. Ethan Walker, slumped in his chair, presented a picture of adolescent detachment, his gaze fixed on a spot above the detective's head. Although his parents had asserted his right to legal counsel, Ethan, with an ill-advised overconfidence in his intellect, waived his right to silence before his lawyer arrived, eager to engage in what he clearly perceived as a battle of wits. He seemed convinced he could outmaneuver the seasoned detectives, a fatal miscalculation stemming from profound narcissism and a deep underestimation of the judicial system he now confronted. The initial questioning exemplified psychological manipulation, with the lead detective, a veteran of hundreds of such interviews, adopting a calm, almost paternalistic tone. He refrained from accusations, instead posing questions that subtly circled the incident without directly addressing it, allowing Ethan to construct his own web of fabrications. Ethan maintained he was home all night and knew nothing of the event, delivering his answers with a practiced smoothness that betrayed their falsity. He reclined in his chair, affecting an air of casual indifference, but the slight, continuous tapping of his foot revealed a flicker of nervous energy beneath his outwardly serene composure. The detectives patiently let him speak, giving him ample rope, confident that his arrogance would ultimately prove his undoing. The pivotal moment arrived when the detectives placed a single photograph on the table between them, a clear, undeniable still from a neighbor's doorbell camera. It was a simple yet potent maneuver, the first breach in Ethan's meticulously crafted facade of invincibility. His relaxed posture stiffened, his eyes darting between the image and the detectives' faces. The faint smirk he had worn finally vanished. For the first time, a flicker of genuine emotion, not remorse, but anger at being caught flashed across his face. The game had irrevocably changed, the balance of power had shifted, and the walls of the small room seemed to press in on him. With his alibi shattered, Ethan's demeanor underwent a chilling metamorphosis. The pretense of innocence evaporated, replaced by a cold, dispassionate confession, delivered without a hint of guilt or regret. He recounted breaking into David Campbell's house through an unlocked back window, not to steal, but out of boredom. He described the confrontation with the homeowner, the ensuing struggle, and the act of violence itself, his voice a flat monotone, as if narrating a scene from one of his video games. There was no emotional inflection, no hesitation, no indication that he was describing the termination of a human life. It was this absolute and profound absence of empathy, this chilling void where a conscience should have resided, that shocked the detectives more profoundly than the brutal specifics of the crime itself. His confession was not a plea for help or the unburdening of a terrible secret. It was a boast, the proud, unapologetic admission of a monster. With Ethan Walker's confession recorded and the physical evidence secured, the case was transferred to the Franklin County Prosecutor's Office. The prosecution was spearheaded by Assistant District Attorney Olivia Rodriguez, a seasoned prosecutor renowned for her meticulous preparation and formidable presence in court. She understood that a confession, regardless of its damning nature, was merely one piece of the puzzle, particularly when dealing with a juvenile defendant whose statement could be challenged in court. Her primary objective was to construct a case so overwhelmingly buttressed with evidence that it would withstand any legal assault from the defense, thus ensuring Ethan Walker would be tried as an adult and held fully accountable for his actions. The initial step for Rodriguez and her team involved methodically cataloging and analyzing every piece of physical evidence. The blood-stained sneakers underwent DNA analysis, yielding a 1 in a billion match to David Campbell, irrefutably placing Ethan at the crime scene. The unique serrations on the knife discovered in Ethan's room were meticulously compared to the wound patterns documented in the autopsy report, revealing a perfect correlation that conclusively identified it as the murder weapon. Furthermore, fibers from David Campbell's sweater were found on Ethan's hoodie, a critical piece of trace evidence that established the close physical contact of the struggle. Rodriguez recognized that juries respond compellingly to tangible scientific proof, and she was meticulously constructing a fortress of forensic certainty around the defendant. While the forensic team toiled, investigators delved into Ethan Walker's background, seeking the psychological context that might illuminate his monstrous act. They interviewed teachers, classmates, and neighbors, and a disturbing portrait began to emerge. He was characterized as intelligent but profoundly antisocial, a young man who displayed a deep-seated lack of empathy and a propensity for casual cruelty, spanning from bullying weaker students to tormenting small animals. He inhabited a world of his own creation, governed by a sense of entitlement and a conviction that societal rules did not apply to him. This psychological profile was critical for the prosecution, as it would enable them to counteract the inevitable defense narrative of a troubled child who made a terrible mistake. Concurrently, the court appointed Michael Clark, a veteran public defender, to represent Ethan Walker. Clark was an experienced and highly capable attorney, accustomed to handling the most challenging and often thankless cases within the criminal justice system. He recognized from the moment he reviewed the case file that the evidence against his client was formidable, a veritable mountain of proof that rendered a not guilty verdict an impossibility. His strategy, therefore, would not be to argue innocence, but to mitigate the consequences. Clark's sole viable path was to humanize Ethan, to frame the murder as a tragic anomaly stemming from a combination of adolescent immaturity and a troubled, unstable home life, hoping to avert a transfer to adult court and secure a sentence in a juvenile facility rather than a state prison. Michael Clark's initial meetings with his client proved to be a frustrating exercise in futility. Ethan displayed no fear, no remorse, and no comprehension of the gravity of his predicament. He treated the legal proceedings as an intricate game, viewing his attorney not as a lifeline, but as a pawn to be manipulated. He was more preoccupied with the specifics of his notoriety, inquiring if his case was being covered by local news, than with the life he had extinguished or the decades he faced in prison. Clark found himself in the arduous position of attempting to salvage a client who was actively sabotaging his own defense, his chilling arrogance posing a greater obstacle than any piece of evidence the prosecution could present. The prosecution's case was further solidified by a series of pre-trial motions, the most significant of which was the motion to transfer Ethan Walker's case from juvenile to adult court. Olivia Rodriguez argued passionately before Judge James Harris, presenting evidence of the crime's extreme brutality and Ethan's profound lack of remorse as indicators that he was beyond the rehabilitative capacity of the juvenile system. She played excerpts from his taped confession, allowing his flat, emotionless voice to resonate through the courtroom, a chilling testament to his psychological state. She also introduced his sealed juvenile record, which detailed a pattern of escalating antisocial behavior that painted a clear picture of a developing predator. The defense, in turn, presented testimony from a court-appointed psychologist who spoke of Ethan's underdeveloped adolescent brain and a history of parental neglect. Michael Clark argued that his client was a product of his environment, a damaged child who lacked the emotional maturity to grasp the finality of his actions. He implored the judge to grant the boy an opportunity for rehabilitation, to not cast him into the adult system where he would be permanently lost. It was a classic nature versus nurture argument, a defense constructed on the shifting sands of psychological theory against the solid bedrock of forensic fact. After 2 days of hearings, Judge Harris delivered his ruling. He acknowledged the defense's arguments regarding Ethan's age and background, but ultimately determined that the sheer brutality of the crime and the defendant's complete and utter lack of empathy warranted his trial as an adult. He cited the criminal sophistication of the act and the clear danger Ethan posed to the public, concluding that the juvenile system was inadequate to address the severity of the offense. The decision represented a significant victory for the prosecution and a devastating blow to the defense, ensuring that when Ethan Walker faced a jury, he would be judged not as a child, but as a man confronting the full weight of the law. Throughout it all, Ethan sat at the defense table, a slight, almost imperceptible smirk on his face, as if he still believed it was merely part of the game. With the trial now scheduled in the Franklin County Court of Common Pleas, the defense's focus shifted from legal strategy to psychological stagecraft. Michael Clark knew that the only currency he had left to spend with a jury was pity, and the sole way to earn it was to coax some semblance of remorse from his client. The legal battle was all but lost. The battle for public perception, however, was just initiating. The objective was to reframe Ethan Walker, the admitted murderer, as Ethan Walker, the tragic misguided youth, a portrayal that demanded his client's active and enthusiastic involvement. Coaching sessions unfolded within the sterile, soundproofed meeting rooms of the county jail. Clark meticulously advised Ethan on the nuances of courtroom decorum, precise seating, appropriate attire, and the projection of an aura of solemnity and regret. He instructed him to maintain a downcast gaze, avoiding direct eye contact with the jury or the victim's family, and to absorb testimony with a pained, introspective expression. He even orchestrated non-verbal cues, such as a slow, sorrowful head shake, during the presentation of particularly graphic evidence. This was a cynical, desperate theatrical performance, an attempt to construct a facade of remorse to conceal the underlying void. Yet, Ethan proved to be a challenging and unwilling pupil. He regarded his lawyer's directives with overt contempt, ridiculing the notion of feigning sadness as an indicator of weakness. In his twisted perspective, remorse signified an admission of guilt, and guilt was reserved for the powerless. He perceived the trial not as an accountability for his actions, but as a stage for his intellectual dominance, a platform where he would outsmart the prosecutor, the judge, and the jury. This profound detachment from reality fostered a widening rift between Ethan and his own legal counsel. Clark's earnest efforts to rescue him were consistently undermined by the very individual he sought to safeguard. Pre-trial hearings swiftly evolved into a public spectacle, showcasing Ethan's escalating arrogance. During a motion to suppress his confession, a routine, albeit often futile, legal tactic by the defense, Ethan sat at the table, idly sketching on a legal pad, occasionally glancing up to smirk at the prosecutors or roll his eyes at the detective's testimony. His conduct was not the subtle defiance of a nervous adolescent, but the audacious, overt contempt of someone convinced of his untouchability. Local media, attending the hearing, began to report on his chilling demeanor, and the narrative of the smirking teenage killer began to embed itself in the public consciousness long before jury selection even commenced. Michael Clark's frustration mounted with each passing day. He found himself ensnared in an ethical and strategic quagmire, legally bound to defend a client who appeared intent on orchestrating his own conviction. He explored various approaches, from stern warnings about the repercussions of his behavior to desperate pleas to his self-interest, explaining that a jury would not hesitate to condemn a remorseless killer to life imprisonment. But his words were utterly ineffective, akin to water on stone. Ethan's narcissism was an impregnable fortress, repelling any attempt to penetrate his illusion of invincibility. He simply could not conceive of a world where he wasn't the most intelligent person in the room, a world where his actions bore genuine, lasting consequences. For Olivia Rodriguez and the prosecution team, Ethan's behavior was an unexpected boon. Every smirk, every eye roll, every display of casual indifference was another nail in his legal coffin. While Michael Clark strove to construct a fragile narrative of a troubled youth, Ethan himself was providing the jury with a real-time demonstration of his true character. Rodriguez instructed her team to simply observe and document, allowing the defendant to be his own worst enemy. Her trial strategy began to solidify. She would present the cold, hard facts of the case, and then let the jury witness the monster with their own eyes, confident that his arrogance would be more damning than any testimony she could elicit. The relationship between Ethan and his mother, Elizabeth Walker, also began to fracture. During her visits to the jail, she implored him to heed his lawyer, to exhibit some sign of remorse for the sake of his future. Yet her words were met with the same dismissive contempt he directed at Michael Clark. He perceived her tears not as expressions of a mother's agony, but as a manipulative display of weakness. Their conversations grew increasingly strained, her desperate attempts to connect with her son thwarted by the impenetrable wall of his pathology. She was slowly realizing that the boy she had nurtured, the child she had enabled and shielded for years, was a stranger to her, a chilling enigma whose depth she was only now beginning to grasp. The final pre-trial hearing served as a dress rehearsal for the impending disaster. As the prosecutor meticulously detailed the horrific specifics of the murder weapon, Ethan emitted a short, audible laugh, a sound so startling and out of place that a ripple of murmurs spread through the courtroom. Judge Harris slammed his gavel, his face frozen in cold fury, and warned the defendant that any further outbursts would result in his removal from the proceedings. But the damage was already irreparable. The mask of remorse had not merely slipped. It had been violently ripped off and discarded by Ethan himself, exposing the sneering, unrepentant face of a killer, eagerly anticipating his moment in the spotlight. Michael Clark could only bury his head in his hands, fully aware that the upcoming trial would not be a defense but an exercise in damage control for a blaze his own client had gleefully ignited. The inaugural day of the trial of the state of Ohio versus Ethan Walker dawned cold and gray, the weather a fitting mirror of the grim proceedings poised to unfold within the Franklin County Courthouse. The courtroom was packed, a tense and somber congregation of media, legal professionals, and members of the public drawn by the case's brutal nature. On one side of the room sat David Campbell's family, their faces etched with a grief that had not diminished in the months since his death, their presence a silent, constant reminder of the profound human cost of the crime. On the opposing side, at the defense table, sat Ethan Walker, garbed in a borrowed suit 2 sizes too large, a faint, almost imperceptible smirk playing at the corners of his mouth as he surveyed the surroundings with the detached curiosity of a spectator. Jury selection had been an arduous process, with both the prosecution and the defense meticulously screening potential jurors for any biases that might sway their judgment. Olivia Rodriguez sought logical, analytical thinkers who would be swayed by the weight of forensic evidence, while Michael Clark looked for empathetic, compassionate individuals who might be receptive to a narrative of a troubled youth. After 3 days of questioning, a panel of 12 citizens and 2 alternates was seated, a cross-section of the community now tasked with delivering judgment on a crime that had reverberated through their city's core. They took their seats in the jury box, their faces impassive, their eyes fixed on the young man whose fate now rested in their hands. The trial commenced, as all trials do, with the opening statements, a pivotal first act in the legal drama where both sides delineate the roadmap of their respective cases. Olivia Rodriguez approached the lectern with a quiet, self-assured authority. Her voice was clear and steady as she began to speak, addressing not the judge or the defense, but directly engaging the jury. She painted a vivid and heart-wrenching portrait of David Campbell, not merely as a victim, but as a beloved teacher, a devoted brother, and a kind neighbor. A man whose life of quiet contribution had been savagely extinguished without any discernible reason. She described him as a pillar of the community, an individual who built his life around knowledge and kindness, making the senselessness of his death all the more profound. Rodriguez then transitioned to the crime itself, her tone shifting from sorrowful to clinically precise. She methodically laid out the evidence the jury would encounter: the DNA, the murder weapon, the security camera footage, and, crucially, the defendant's own chilling, emotionless confession. She employed powerful, evocative language, characterizing the crime not as an error, but as an act of profound moral emptiness. She concluded her statement by pointing directly at the defendant, her voice resonating with conviction. "Over the next few days," she declared, "you will witness the evidence, you will hear the testimony, and you will look into the eyes of the young man who perpetrated this horrific act, and you will discern not a lost child, but a cold, calculating killer who, even now, at this very moment, exhibits not a flicker of remorse for his actions." Then it was Michael Clark's turn. He approached the jury with the world-weary, burdened demeanor of a man carrying an insuperable weight. His strategy hinged on concession and redirective narrative. He did not dispute the fundamental facts of the case, acknowledging that his client bore responsibility for David Campbell's death. This was a calculated gamble, designed to cultivate a sliver of credibility with the jury by avoiding an insulting, unbelievable claim of innocence. The crux of his argument, he elucidated, was not about the what, but the why. He promised the jury they would hear a different account, a story of a boy adrift in a tempest of neglect, psychological turmoil, and undiagnosed mental health challenges. Clark depicted Ethan's life as a desolate panorama of emotional abandonment, a world where he was left to navigate the treacherous currents of adolescence without guidance or support. He spoke of a broken boy, not a monster, framing the killing as a catastrophic failure of his underdeveloped mind to process impulse and consequence. He implored the jury to look beyond the horrific act and perceive the damaged child underneath, urging them to choose compassion over condemnation, rehabilitation over retribution. It was a masterfully delivered speech, a heartfelt appeal to the jury's nobler instincts. Its efficacy, however, was being systematically eroded by the very individual it was designed to protect. Throughout both opening statements, Ethan Walker's behavior became a textbook example of self-sabotage. Despite the detailed and damning evidence presented against him, Rodriguez struggled to suppress a yawn, openly displaying his indifference to the jury. When his own legal counsel spoke of his tumultuous past and emotional anguish, Ethan's head shook almost imperceptibly, a small, dismissive gesture that unequivocally conveyed his disbelief. He fiddled with his tie, whispered to his attorney, and casually surveyed the faces in the gallery, his occasional smirk blossoming into a full smile when he met someone's gaze. The stark contrast between the gravity of the proceedings and the defendant's flippant demeanor created a widening chasm throughout the trial. The jury, captivated by this spectacle, observed him with a blend of fascination and revulsion. His behavior was not merely disrespectful, it was utterly alien, a complete defiance of the societal and moral conventions governing the courtroom and the broader world. Michael Clark's painstakingly crafted portrayal of a tormented youth disintegrated before his eyes, replaced by the far more compelling and terrifying truth that Olivia Rodriguez had promised. The reality of a killer who simply couldn't care less. The trial had barely begun, yet the most potent evidence against Ethan Walker was already glaringly apparent. With the opening statements concluded, the trial moved into its evidentiary phase, and Olivia Rodriguez meticulously constructed her case, piece by methodical piece. Her presentation was a masterclass in narrative control, designed to guide the jury on an undeniable path from the initial 911 call to the defendant's chilling confession. She began by summoning the first responders, police officers, and paramedics, who described in grim, professional detail the horrific scene they encountered at David Campbell's residence. Their testimony, unembellished and stark, painted a picture of brutal violence that immediately stripped away any clinical detachment, grounding the proceedings in the raw, physical reality of the crime. Next came the forensic experts, a procession of scientists and lab technicians who translated the silent language of the evidence into clear, irrefutable facts. The DNA analyst testified that the blood found on Ethan's sneakers conclusively matched David Campbell's. The toolmark expert confirmed that the serrated knife from Ethan's bedroom was, to a scientific certainty, the weapon used in the assault. Each piece of testimony was bolstered by large, clear visual aids photographs of the evidence, DNA charts, and microscopic comparisons, making the complex science accessible to the jury. Rodriguez conducted her questioning with a calm, deliberate cadence, allowing the weight of each fact to settle in the courtroom before proceeding to the next, erecting an inescapable wall of proof around the defendant. Throughout this damning presentation, Ethan Walker's behavior grew increasingly audacious. He leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, adopting an air of profound boredom. When crime scene photos depicting the devastating aftermath of his actions were displayed on the large screen for the jury, he scrutinized them with a detached, analytical curiosity, as if examining an abstract work of art. Several jurors flinched and averted their gaze from the graphic images, but Ethan's stare remained unwavering. At one point during the testimony of the medical examiner, who detailed the 28 separate stab wounds, Ethan was observed whispering to his lawyer and letting out a small, quiet laugh, a sound that, though barely audible, was noticed by several members of the jury and the victim's family. Amelia Sanchez, David Campbell's sister, had to be escorted from the courtroom in tears, her composure finally shattered by the dual burden of the graphic testimony and the defendant's repulsive disrespect. Her choked sobs offered a stark counterpoint to Ethan's casual indifference, a moment of raw human grief that seemed to drain the air from the room. Judge Harris paused the proceedings, his eyes fixed on Ethan with undisguised contempt. He issued a stern warning to the defense table, his voice low and dangerous, making it clear that the court's patience was wearing thin. Yet, These warnings had no effect. In his own world, Ethan remained impervious to the court's authority and the suffering of others. The centerpiece of the prosecution's case was the playing of Ethan's taped confession. The courtroom descended into a deep, uncomfortable silence as his voice, flat, emotionless, and imbued with a slight adolescent arrogance, filled the space. The jury listened intently as Ethan recounted the murder with the same casual detachment he might use to describe a movie he had seen. He spoke of his boredom, his curiosity, and the disappointing lack of a real struggle from his victim. There was no hint of remorse, no flicker of regret, only the cold, clinical recitation of a monstrous act. It was, as Rodriguez had intended, the clearest possible window into his soul, revealing nothing but a chilling, empty void. As his own voice echoed through the courtroom, admitting to the horrific crime, Ethan observed the jury's reactions. He appeared to be studying their faces, not for signs of sympathy or condemnation, but as if they were subjects in an experiment. The smirk returned to his face, a clear, unambiguous expression of pride and defiance. He was not ashamed of what he had done. He was proud of it. He had orchestrated this moment. He was the focal point of this drama, and in his mind, that made him powerful. The confession, intended as the prosecution's ultimate weapon, had also become Ethan's ultimate performance, a public declaration of his perceived superiority. When the tape concluded, a heavy silence lingered in the air. Olivia Rodriguez stood at her table, allowing the impact of the confession to resonate, her expression somber. She had presented her case with devastating efficiency, laying out a chain of evidence so strong and a psychological portrait so clear that it seemed to leave no room for doubt. The physical evidence proved that Ethan Walker had committed the act. His own words, and more importantly, his behavior in the courtroom, proved that he had done so without a conscience. Michael Clark sat at the defense table, weighed down by his client's self-destruction. He had known the prosecution's case was robust, but he had underestimated the power of Ethan's own personality to amplify its impact. Every attempt he had planned to generate sympathy for his client had been preemptively dismantled by the defendant himself. As the prosecution rested its case, Clark knew he faced not just a mountain of evidence, but a tidal wave of revulsion that his client had single-handedly created. He was now tasked with defending the indefensible, with unearthing the humanity in a young man who had shown none. The burden now shifted to Michael Clark, who rose to present his defense with the weary resignation of a soldier ordered on a suicide mission. His strategy was a delicate and desperate balancing act. He could not refute the facts, so he had to reframe them, attempting to transform the prosecution's narrative of a cold-blooded monster into a tragic story of a neglected and mentally ill child. His entire case hinged on the jury's ability to find a sliver of compassion for a defendant who had, until this point, proven himself utterly undeserving of it. His primary and sole objective was to introduce the concept of why into a case that seemed terrifyingly devoid of reason. Clark's first witness was a forensic psychologist, Dr. Evelyn Reed, a respected expert in adolescent brain development and antisocial personality disorders. Dr. Reed testified that Ethan exhibited many classic traits of a teenager with severe conduct disorder and narcissistic tendencies, compounded by what she described as a profoundly deficient empathetic capacity. Using simplified charts and diagrams, she explained to the jury how the prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain responsible for impulse control and understanding consequences, is not fully developed in teenagers. She argued that while Ethan understood the difference between right and wrong on an intellectual level, he lacked the neurological hardware to process the emotional weight and finality of his actions. During his direct examination, Clark guided Dr. Reed through Ethan's bleak family history, characterized by emotional neglect from a distant, often absent father and inconsistent, enabling behavior from his mother. Dr. Reed testified that this environment likely exacerbated Ethan's underlying psychological issues, creating a perfect storm for a catastrophic breakdown of moral reasoning. The narrative she presented was one of a damaged product of a broken system, a boy whose internal wiring was faulty and whose external support structure was non-existent. It was a compelling, if theoretical, argument, an attempt to replace the image of a monster with a more palatable image of a victim of circumstance and biology. However, the effectiveness of Dr. Reed's testimony was severely blunted during cross-examination by Olivia Rodriguez. With surgical precision, Rodriguez dismantled the defense's narrative, forcing Dr. Reed to concede that millions of teenagers have undeveloped brains and come from difficult homes without resorting to brutal murder. She sharply questioned, "Dr. Reed, are you asserting that a difficult childhood excuses stabbing a man 28 times?" The question, cutting and direct, hung in the air, highlighting the vast disparity between psychological theory and the brutal reality of the crime. Rodriguez compelled the psychologist to admit that, ultimately, Ethan had made a choice, a series of choices that led him to David Campbell's doorstep. Throughout Dr. Reed's testimony, Ethan watched with a smug, knowing look on his face, as if her clinical diagnosis of his pathology were a badge of honor, a confirmation of his unique and complex nature. As she detailed his narcissistic tendencies, he subtly nodded, a hint of self-satisfaction in his eyes. He wasn't the helpless youth his lawyer was attempting to portray. Rather, he considered himself an intriguing enigma, a superior individual whose deeds were beyond the understanding of the average jury member. His entire demeanor subtly undermined his own defense, silently communicating to the court that he was not a casualty, but a proud and willing participant in his own monstrous acts. Clark's subsequent witnesses included several teachers and a former guidance counselor, all of whom consistently depicted a troubled and solitary young man. They acknowledged his academic brilliance, but also highlighted his social isolation, his subtle maliciousness towards peers, and his absolute refusal to accept accountability for his actions. While Clark had hoped their testimony would generate sympathy, the opposite occurred. Their accounts, intended to illustrate a cry for help, instead sounded like a progression of ignored warning signs, painting a picture of a developing predator. Each anecdote regarding his past behavior only served to solidify the image of the cold, arrogant young man the jury observed daily. The defense's final witness was intended to be Ethan's mother, Elizabeth Walker. Michael Clark had prepared her for weeks, banking on her ability to deliver a tearful, humanizing portrait of her son, speaking of the sweet child he once was before succumbing to his inner demons. This was a high-risk, high-reward approach, a desperate attempt to sway the jury's emotions. However, in a private meeting just before she was scheduled to testify, Elizabeth broke down, confessing to Clark that she could not, in good conscience, deliver the narrative he had fabricated. She had witnessed her son's behavior in court, and a terrible, dawning realization had taken hold, compelling her to confront a truth she had spent years evading. And so, with his crucial witness refusing to cooperate as planned, Michael Clark was compelled to rest his case. The defense's narrative, already compromised by the defendant himself and eroded by the prosecution's cross-examination, concluded not with a powerful emotional appeal, but with a whimper. He had hurled psychological theories and tales of a difficult past against the formidable wall of the prosecution's evidence, but nothing had resonated. The jury was left with two conflicting images: the defense's theoretical broken boy and the prosecution's very real, very present monster, who at that very moment was smirking at his lawyer's evident defeat. With the defense having concluded its case, the trial moved into its final, poignant phase before closing arguments: the victim impact statements. This was the moment the court formally acknowledged that the crime had not merely violated laws, but had irrevocably shattered human lives. It offered an opportunity for David Campbell's family to address the court and the man who had murdered their loved one directly, to articulate the grief and devastation that had been a silent, ever-present character in the courtroom drama. The atmosphere in the room grew heavy with anticipation, the usual legalistic proceedings giving way to a more raw and deeply personal form of testimony. Amelia Sanchez, David's sister, was the first to speak. She walked to the podium, her steps faltering, clutching a folded piece of paper in her trembling hands. Her voice, when she began, was thick with unshed tears, yet it held an undeniable core of strength. She did not discuss the crime or the evidence. She spoke of David. She told the court about his infectious laugh, his terrible puns, his kindness to stray animals, and the way his face lit up when explaining a piece of history to one of his students. She painted a portrait of a life rich in small, meaningful moments, a life that was a gift to everyone who knew him. He was not just a name in a case file, she declared, her eyes finding Ethan Walker across the room. "He was my brother. He was the kindest man I have ever known, and you took him from us. You took him, and you left a hole that will never, ever be filled." Her words were not uttered with rage, but with a profound, unfathomable sorrow that was far more potent. She spoke of holidays that would never be the same, family traditions broken forever, and the eerie silence where his voice should be. Her statement served as a testament to the true nature of murder, not a singular act of violence, but a permanent amputation of a family's soul. As Amelia Sanchez spoke, pouring her heart out to the court, Ethan Walker observed her with a look of cold, clinical detachment. He displayed no sadness, no empathy, no reaction whatsoever. He simply stared, his expression vacant, as if watching a mildly uninteresting television program. There was no glimmer of humanity in his eyes, no recognition of the immense pain his actions had inflicted. To him, her grief was an abstraction, a foreign language he could not, and did not wish to, comprehend. For the jury and everyone else in the courtroom, his lack of reaction was perhaps the most damning evidence yet. A final, horrifying confirmation of the empty space where his conscience should have resided. After Amelia concluded and returned to her seat, enveloped in her husband's arms, the prosecution informed the judge that they had no further statements. The trial appeared to be hurtling towards its conclusion. But just as Judge Harris was about to address the lawyers to schedule closing arguments, a figure rose in the gallery. It was Elizabeth Walker, Ethan's mother. Her face was pale, her eyes red-rimmed, but her posture was resolute. "Your Honor," she said, her voice trembling but clear, "I need to speak." A ripple of surprise and confusion swept through the courtroom. Michael Clark sprang to his feet, objecting immediately, asserting that the defense had already rested its case. Olivia Rodriguez, though taken aback, remained silent, sensing that something momentous was about to unfold. Judge Harris looked down at the distraught woman, his expression a blend of sternness and curiosity. He knew this was highly irregular, a clear deviation from standard courtroom procedure. Yet, he also perceived in her eyes a desperation and a need that transcended legal protocol. "Mrs. Walker," the judge said, his voice level, "the time for testimony has passed. On what grounds do you wish to address the court?" "On the grounds of the truth," she replied, her voice gaining strength. "The whole truth. Not the story my son's lawyer wanted me to tell. Not the story I have been telling myself for years. The truth about who my son is and what I helped him become." The courtroom was plunged into profound silence. Michael Clark looked at his client's mother with a sense of dread, realizing his meticulously constructed defense was about to be completely and utterly demolished. Ethan stared at his mother. The smirk finally vanished from his face, replaced by a look of pure, unadulterated fury. This was a betrayal he had not foreseen, a variable he had not controlled. For the first time in the entire trial, the mask of cool indifference shattered, revealing the raging, entitled monster beneath. Judge Harris considered the request for a long moment, the fate of the trial hanging precariously in the balance, before nodding slowly. "The court will allow it," he stated, his voice echoing in the silent room. "Mrs. Walker, you may approach the witness stand." Elizabeth Walker walked to the witness stand as if in a trance, her movements slow and deliberate. She neither looked at her son, whose eyes were now burning with a hateful glare, nor at the jury, who watched her with rapt attention. She took the oath, her hand trembling slightly as she placed it on the Bible, her voice barely a whisper as she swore to tell the truth. The whole truth, and nothing but the truth. This was no longer a mere legal proceeding. It was a confession, a final, desperate act of a mother who had reached the absolute end of her rope, ready to immolate the lies she had spent a lifetime constructing to shield her child. Olivia Rodriguez, recognizing the gravity of the moment, approached the stand with a gentle, questioning demeanor, her usual prosecutorial sharpness softened. "Mrs. Walker," she began, "you told the judge you wanted to tell the truth. What is the truth you need this court to hear?" Elizabeth took a deep, shuddering breath, her gaze fixed on some distant point, and began to speak. Her testimony was not a structured narrative, but a torrent of painful memories, a flood of repressed guilt and dawning horror that she had suppressed for years. She meticulously dismantled, piece by painful piece, the defense's narrative of a broken boy who was a victim of neglect. She informed the court that Ethan had not been neglected. He had been enabled from a very young age. He had displayed a chilling lack of empathy and a propensity for cruelty, and she had consistently made excuses for him. She recounted how she had explained away his torturing of neighborhood pets as mere childish curiosity, and how she had dismissed his bullying of smaller children as typical boys being boys. She admitted to lying to teachers, to principals, and even to the police to protect him from the consequences of his increasingly disturbing behavior. She described a home where he was the undisputed center of the universe, a boy who was never told no, whose every whim was indulged, and whose every transgression was covered up. "I didn't want to see it," she said, her voice cracking with self-incrimination. "I wanted to believe he was just a difficult child, that he would outgrow it. I told myself that if I just loved him enough, he would be okay. But my love wasn't love. It was poison. I built him a world with no consequences, and I taught him that he was entitled to do whatever he wanted, to take whatever he wanted because he was special." Her testimony was a stark and brutal confession of her failings as a parent, a candid acknowledgement of her role in cultivating the malevolence embodied by the figure at the defense table. She then recounted the years leading up to the murder, detailing Ethan's escalating fascination with violence, his deepening isolation, and his cold, dismissive interactions with both her and his father. A chilling admission followed. She confessed to being afraid of him, of the vacant chill in his gaze and the simmering fury barely contained beneath his composed exterior. While the defense had sought to portray a boy desperately seeking help, his mother now unveiled a predator, honing his brutal instincts openly, shielded by a mother's deliberate blindness. The pivotal moment, she elucidated, arrived when she observed him in court, smirking and laughing at the profound grief of the Campbell family. It was then, she explained, that she recognized the boy she had protected was gone, supplanted by something frigid, empty, and devoid of redemption. "When I saw him laugh," she whispered, tears now silently carving paths down her face, "I truly saw him for who he is. Not the child I remember, but the man he has become. He feels no empathy for that family. He feels no remorse for his actions. His only anger stems from being apprehended." She averted her gaze from the prosecutor, locking eyes with the jury, her silent plea for understanding palpable. His attorney claims he is a damaged youth, but that is untrue. The truth is, he is a damaged entity. I know this because I am the one who inflicted the damage. The impact of her testimony resonated seismically through the courtroom. It introduced no new physical evidence, yet it was the missing piece of the psychological puzzle, the Rosetta Stone that deciphered Ethan's enigmatic behavior into a clear, chilling narrative. She hadn't excused her son, she had elucidated him, and in doing so, she stripped away every last vestige of sympathy anyone in the room might have harbored for him. Michael Clark sat defeated, his complexion ashen, his defense strategy crumbling around him. He had been utterly and completely caught off guard, his case demolished not by the prosecution, but by the very person he had relied upon to salvage it. Ethan Walker's reaction was explosive. The icy, controlled facade he had maintained for months finally shattered into countless fragments. He lunged forward, his chair scraping violently against the floor, his face contorted into a mask of pure, unadulterated rage. "You're lying!" he shrieked, his voice a raw, primal roar. "You lying! I hate you!" He struggled against the bailiffs who swiftly subdued him, his body thrashing with a wild, impotent fury. The jury watched, their faces a tableau of shock and horror, as the final, terrifying transformation from the smirking, arrogant defendant into the raging, unhinged animal his mother had just described unfolded before them. The breaking point had arrived, not from the weight of justice, but from the searing betrayal of the one person whose affirmation he had always taken for granted. The trial's final day was reduced to a mere formality. Closing arguments were presented, but the verdict had, in essence, already been rendered, not by legal eloquence, but by the raw, undeniable truth of a mother's testimony and her son's subsequent explosion of rage. Olivia Rodriguez's closing statement was concise and impactful. She simply reiterated the evidence and reminded the jury of Elizabeth Walker's devastating confession, concluding, "His own mother unveiled the monster. Now, it is your duty to hold that monster accountable." Michael Clark, appearing utterly defeated, offered a brief, subdued statement, imploring the jury to recall that Ethan was still a young man, a plea that now sounded hollow, even to his own ears. The jury deliberated for less than an hour, the swiftness of their decision underscoring the overwhelming certainty of the case. As they filed back into the courtroom, their expressions were grim and resolute. The foreman presented the verdict to the clerk, who read it aloud in a clear, steady voice. On the charge of aggravated murder, we, the jury, find the defendant, Ethan Walker, guilty. A wave of quiet relief washed over the section of the courtroom occupied by the Campbell family, while a heavy final silence enveloped the defense table. Ethan, now clad in a standard-issue orange jumpsuit and flanked by two burly deputies, displayed no emotion. The rage of the previous day had receded, replaced by a cold, unsettling stillness, his eyes vacant and distant. 2 weeks later, the courtroom was once again filled for the sentencing hearing. The atmosphere was thick with a palpable sense of finality. Judge James Harris, a man renowned for his stern yet fair judicial temperament, entered the room and took his seat, his gaze immediately settling on the defendant. He had presided over hundreds of trials in his extensive career, but he knew this case was different. It transcended mere legal application. It was about affirming a community's moral code in the face of a profound and disturbing emptiness. He had meticulously reviewed the pre-sentencing reports, the psychological evaluations, and the letters from the community, and he was prepared to deliver not just a sentence, but a conclusive, definitive statement. Before passing sentence, Judge Harris addressed the court, his voice a low, powerful rumble that commanded absolute attention. He spoke of the profound loss of David Campbell, a man who exemplified the very best of their community, and the senselessness of the act that had taken his life. He then turned his attention directly to Ethan Walker. For weeks, the judge declared, his eyes piercing the defendant, you have occupied this courtroom with an air of contempt and arrogance that I have rarely witnessed. You have smirked at the victim's grieving family. You have laughed at the evidence of your own monstrous actions. You have treated the most solemn process of our justice system as if it were a game designed for your personal amusement. He paused, allowing the gravity of his words to settle in the silent room. Your attorney contended that you were a product of a broken home, a child who failed to comprehend the repercussions of his actions. But I do not believe that to be the truth. The truth, I believe, was uttered from that witness stand by your own mother. She informed us she cultivated a world for you where consequences simply did not exist. Today, Mr. Walker, that world comes to an end. The judge's voice was cold, hard, and unyielding, the very embodiment of the justice system Ethan had so profoundly underestimated. Your mother's testimony, Judge Harris continued, was not a plea for mercy. It was a warning. It was the final, desperate act of a woman who understood the peril you posed to the world, precisely because she understood the emptiness within you better than anyone. This court will heed that warning. He then delivered the sentence, his words falling with the resounding finality of a hammer. For the crime of aggravated murder, this court sentences you, Ethan Walker, to life in prison without the possibility of parole. A collective, quiet gasp swept through the courtroom. It was the maximum sentence permissible, a clear and unambiguous declaration that Ethan would never again walk free. It was at that precise moment, as the chilling finality of the words, without the possibility of parole, resonated through the courtroom, that the armor of Ethan Walker's arrogance finally, irrevocably shattered. The smirk, the defiance, the cold detachment, it all dissolved in an instant, replaced by a look of raw, uncomprehending panic. His face went slack, his eyes wide with a terror that was shockingly real. It was the gaze of a narcissist whose delusion of invincibility had just collided with an immovable force, the dawning horror of a person who had never faced a true consequence in his entire life, suddenly being confronted with the ultimate one. The game was over, and he had lost. As the bailiffs moved to lead him away, Ethan's composure completely crumbled. A choked, strangled sob escaped his lips, the first genuine display of emotion he had exhibited throughout the entire process. It was not a sob of remorse for David Campbell. It was a sob of pure, selfish terror for himself. He began to struggle weakly against the deputies, his eyes darting around the courtroom, as if searching for an escape that did not exist. His mother watched him depart, her face a mask of stone, her eyes filled with a sorrow so deep it seemed bottomless. She had given him life, and now she had borne witness to its effective end. As the heavy doors of the courtroom closed behind him, sealing his fate, the laughter that had once echoed in the halls of justice was replaced by the sound of a monster, finally and fully comprehending the meaning of defeat.